Hi class. So this is our next lecture video over chapter 10 for your unit 8 quiz. We are almost through the semester. There will just be one more video after this and then you'll be done. So I hope that you are hanging in there and learning all you ever wanted to know about research. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, so here is chapter 10. Let me make this full screen. All right. Chapter 10, more about survey research. So we've definitely talked about surveys already in this class. We talked about how surveys are kind of the easiest way to get information, right? We just send it out. People take it at their own homes and their own spots. Wherever they are, we can get across the internet with them. So it doesn't really restrict us as far as where we're at logistically, and they're cheaper, things like that. So we're going to talk some more about surveys. So if you have a research question and it could be answered with a survey, then maybe that's the way that you're going to want to go. Most survey research is conducted to answer descriptive questions. Another use for it is on steering predictive questions. It allows for self-reporting. So we have all the pros and cons that we've talked about regarding self-reporting, right? But usually it's descriptive questions, right? How do Americans currently feel about the economy? How do 10th graders feel about whatever, right? Like it's more descriptive and not necessarily like hard numbers. We can also test causal research questions, right? So we can do surveys and we can find out, hey, there's a relationship between these two variables. We obviously can't say causation because it's not a true experiment. We can't say one thing's causing another, but we can test if there's a relationship. And we can see like, hey, did this new product that came out affect consumer behavior, right? We had tons of surveys that went out during COVID, right after COVID, about working from home, doing classes from home, asynchronous courses, college students at home, the professors teaching in their offices. I mean, all this um, these new things that hadn't been done before, we were able to look into those via surveys. So psychometrics, which is an elective here, and maybe you've taken it, it's the development of tests for measuring different constructs, right? It's not just a BuzzFeed, what Disney princess are you most like, right? Which race car is your personality, right? They're not random tests like that. True psychological assessments, right? They're developed. They're psychometrics that goes into it behind the scenes, and it's reliable and it's valid and it's measuring what it says it measures and all these things. And so it's not just some random questions and we're going to tell somebody, well, you have high anxiety because we gave you these random questions, right? You want to make sure that the assessment you're using or you're importing into your survey is reliable and valid. So when you're writing these questions, the type of questions that you're writing affect the validity on the other end, right? You need to make sure that your questions are really specific and that they're asking what you think they're asking, right? When someone else is reading it, that they're going to read that and answer the way that you intended for it to be answered. So issues to avoid, right? We don't want negative wording, right? Do you believe that climate change is not an important issue? Well, that's a negatively worded question. And so there's a better way to word that. So we wouldn't say it like that. What about double-barreled questions? So that's when one question has like two questions in one, right? It needs to be simple. So if you said it like, do you often get depressed and talk to others about it? Well, that's two questions, and you're not there to ask. They're taking this at their house or on their cell phone or whatever. So make sure that that's two questions. You know, it needs to be as simple as possible. Don't ask loaded questions that assume too much. When you talk about depression to your friends, whom do you speak to about it? Well, you just assumed that they did talk to their friends about depression, and now you're asking which ones. But if I did not experience depression and I'm not asking my friends about it, how can I answer that question because it was loaded? And don't do that. And then leading questions, right? Do you agree with the majority of Americans who believe that blah 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 is wrong? Well, you just told them pretty much everyone in America believes that. So are you going to say that too? Right? Don't lead. Just ask the question point blank. There's also some open-ended responses you could have. So you could just have a question that says, what's your favorite type of music? and then people can put in whatever they want. That's pretty cool because you can get a whole bunch of information that way, but also a little dangerous, right? On the scoring end on the backside, say you had 200 people take your survey, well, you could have 200 answers because someone could have said blues and someone could have said jazz and someone could have said jazz blues and someone could have said country and western and country western and country pop, and the list goes on, and then you have to categorize that on the backside of it. So you can have open-ended responses if you want, but it might be better depending on future you and what you want to do with this data if you had country, jazz, blues, Christian, folk, pop, whatever, right? If you had categories. Because if you leave a blank there, people are going to type in whatever they want. And the way it's going to score it, if someone put a space or an and, or they worded it differently, it could really be the same thing. And you're going to have to go through every single answer and look at those and be like, oh yeah, these are all go in my country category. These all go in my rock category. It's a lot of work, but depending on what you're asking, you might need it to be open-ended. Closed-ended questions are what we just talked about, right? Where they have to choose. There's a list of answers and they have to choose. Or it could be the Likert scales, right? On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree, and then the other numbers are in between. The no's give you, there's only 5 options, right? So when you're coding or you're scoring on the back end, you do have to have a coding scheme, but it's easy, right? You only had 5 answers. So 1 is low and 5 is high and 3 is in the middle, and you can score it that way. Closed-ended responses involve nominal, ordinal, or interval measurement scales. They avoid bias, right? Because they're clear. They are, here's the response, and you put it in. The more response options you have might increase validity, right? So maybe if you just said true or false, that might not really get people to answer the way they feel. But if you had, on a scale of 1 to 5, on a scale of 1 to 10, the more options you give them, the more valid it might be. You just need to make sure that you can score it at the end. Consider a neutral response option, right? Like the no opinion or this doesn't apply to me, something like that. So you know that if the data from that participant, it's not going to throw it off, because you can throw that one out and say, oh, well, they don't experience depression, so their answers to the next 5 questions aren't helpful because they said already that they're not experiencing that. There was a neutral option. And then the choices shouldn't be overlapping, right? They should be able to clearly choose between these options and not feel like, oh, but those are both kind of the same thing, so I don't know which one to choose. You should pilot test it with a small group, right? Because you've built the survey and you know what it means and you know what it's asking, but sometimes you have typos, or you worded that question really carefully and you really thought it was clear, and your little pilot group's taking it and they're like, what does this mean? Right? So test it out on somebody, a few people, hopefully. And then the qualitative data, that's the analysis of the process when it's open-ended questions, right? Quantitative is the other one where we have the numbers to look at, but qualitative is what is more descriptive. So you need to create a coding scheme for that and then refine your coding scheme. So when we're looking at the psychometric properties, validity is the first piece we look at, right? There's criterion related validity. This is based on the relationship between the survey and the criterion measures. So if you're testing the criteria related validity to determine that the survey could predict behavior, you as the researcher do that, right? You test it to make sure this is valid and this is predicting what I think. And then validity is important when you're measuring the psychological construct. So if there's, surveys that have already been done that are validated, right? Don't reinvent a depression scale. Go get the Beck depression inventory, right? There's already one out there that's valid and reliable. Use that. You can search for questionnaires that are already valid, like I'm saying. And then when you're making your new survey, consider the question's space validity, right? Like how valid does that question seem? Present questions to your group for testing, and then you want to test it for item reliability. So you can do some stats on the back end and make sure that all these questions are actually loading into what this test says it assesses that it really does. And you can do that with SPSS. You can probably do it with JASP. You can probably look up, if it's a pretty well-known assessment, you could just look up its item reliability, and it'll tell you, I'm sure someone's done the data and surveys and statistics out there to say, yeah, questions 1 through 10 all load into this depression score, but question 8 didn't really matter. And so you can decide, well, do I need question 8, right? I don't know. You don't want to be messing with stuff, but it's good to know when you're writing up your lab report or your document for publication on the, next stage, that we got these answers, we got the significance or non-significance, but question 6 and questions 8 didn't have inter-item relatability, and they didn't load into the overall scores, and just something else to talk about and something else to know. Longer surveys can increase reliability, right? If I asked you in 5 questions if you were depressed or not versus 50 questions, right? The more questions there are, the better chance we have of it being reliable. And we know something's reliable if someone's scores are consistent over time. Think about your Myers-Briggs, right? If you've taken it in high school and then you took it in college and you take it in 5 years and 5 more years, you're probably going to have the same letters. And that's one of the ways we know that Myers-Briggs is reliable, because it's just consistent over time. It is hard to get participants to retake questionnaires, right? Especially if you sent it out over the internet. How do you find all of those people again and ask them to retake it? But sometimes scores might change due to personality or attitudes. My Myers-Briggs letters, all 4 of them, have been the same for probably 17 years. And then about 2 months ago, one of my letters changed. And if you look at like the scale, the sliding scale, here's in the middle, my letter changed from like this side to this side. So overall, statistically, my numbers didn't move that much. It was enough to change my letter. And I was freaking out. I was like, oh my gosh, Myers-Briggs is reliable and it's validated. And how could my letters have changed? And just that one letter. But I thought about it, we went through COVID and I got my master's degree and I became a mom and we moved, and there was a whole lot of like personal changes over the last couple of years. And so when I look back on it that way and I look at my letter that changed, I'm like, okay, well, that does make sense. So it's not that the Myers-Briggs isn't reliable. It's that I had enough life events to affect me just enough to move my letter to the other side of the cutoff. And so sometimes you just grow and adapt, and that's okay. So the internal consistency of scores is important, right? How similar scores and different items are related. You can look at the correlation between the scores. Split half reliability is when there's a correlation between the scores that creates little subsets. And then you could average out the correlations for the entire survey to get your stats that way. So you could give a survey in person, right? You could have an in-person experiment or survey. People come in and they take it, and then you take the paper back. It could be in person or an in-person computer, right? They're taking it in front of you, but they're clicking it on the computer. Could be virtual, where you've just sent it out and people are scanning QR codes or taking it off a local Facebook group, whatever. Or it could be oral, like you could actually ask them every question and then write down the answer. If you were doing research in like prisons, that's how it would have to be, right? You would ask each inmate the question and you would write down their answers. Or it could be over the phone. Maybe if you were doing it with someone who is far away, but not really someone who has access to a computer or technologically advanced, maybe you could ask it over the phone. Any way that they can hear or read the question, and then the responses can be recorded. You could mail them out. You could email them out. You could have a phone list. That's a little bit old school, but you could. I mean, you all still get political calls, right? Everyone probably just got a million a few months ago, trying to get lots of answers really quickly. Also text surveys, right? I get a lot of Texas political text surveys, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why I'm on the list. I'm not sure how to get off the list, but they do text me and ask me questions, and I never reply. Mailing surveys, which could be expensive. I know one of the stores that I shop at, every time I go in there and check out, I get a text later that day that says, please rate your experience with our store to be entered for a $50 gift card. Most of the time I do, because who doesn't want a $50 gift card to a store that you're shopping at anyway? Sometimes I don't, and it's annoying, and I'm like, look, I already bought my stuff. It was fine. If it was bad, I'd tell you. But that's probably why they do that, right? Because typically the only people who send out their opinions are people who are outliers, right? People who are really, really dissatisfied or really, really satisfied. But everybody in the middle, the average Americans on this bell curve here, we never say anything. Mailing surveys can be expensive. I think we're at like 56 cents a stamp. I'm not sure actually how many cents a stamp is worth, but it's a lot, right? It's at least half a dollar or a dollar for every two that you mail out. That adds up. But mail and phone surveys have low response rates, like we just talked about. I'm not going to respond, and probably you aren't either. Email list might be easier. I know when I was conducting some research in college, I would send emails to people, but they were already people that I knew. So maybe that affected whether or not they would reply. Web surveys usually get larger and more diverse samples, right? You're trying to look at how kids with autism, how the family unit's affected. So you find an online Facebook group for parents of kids with autism and you post your survey in there. Hey, I'm a college student at so and so looking at how having a kid with autism in the family affects the family unit. If anyone has some time and they can fill out the survey, I'd really appreciate it. You're probably going to get more people than you would any other way to fill out your survey. Then there's non-response errors and coverage errors. So people just didn't reply, but it threw off your data, or maybe you missed some section. So how can you recruit them and get them to complete your survey? Make sure it's accessible. The instructions need to be really clear. Have a friendly greeting at the beginning. Bug them a few times. And then an incentive, right? Like the store I shop at. $50 gift card, maybe. Although that's not enough to get me to do it every time. But when Whataburger says, if you fill out the survey on the receipt, you will get a free Whataburger, I mean, that incentivizes me. I'll do that. Sometimes people are unwilling to accurately represent their behaviors, and that's a threat to validity because how are you ever going to know the difference, right? So there's some bias in there because of social desirability and people want to appear a certain way. And so we try to include this. We try to get a big enough end that hopefully washes out the threat to the validity, but it is still there, right? You don't know if someone's answering honestly or not, but we hope they are. So let me stop my share. That's probably everything you ever wanted to know about survey research. Yeah, I don't have anything else for you. If you were in class, we would do some activities on it, but you're online. So that's all I have for you. Now you can take quiz over Unit 8.